Welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Trio with Wildflowers. And on this week's episode, I want to talk about flowers, and I was inspired to pursue this topic because it is springtime, no matter what the weather might say. The flowers are certainly coming out, and the birds are starting to sing, and so I thought it was a nice time of year to start thinking about these things that we see more and more of as the days grow longer and the weather gets a bit warmer. But then I also realized that this week is a week of Valentine's Day, and of course every year for Valentine's Day lots of people get each other flowers. So I thought it would be really appropriate to take a step back and kind of think about the natural history of these things and think about what they are and where they come from and what they do, and maybe that will make you kind of see Valentine's Day in a whole new way when you go out and buy flowers for someone or get flowers from someone, because these are really symbolic, I guess, and actually quite appropriate for Valentine's Day when you consider what flowers are all about. So what is a flower? Well, of course we all know what a flower looks like, or at least we're able to identify certain flowers that we see a lot of. But just to think about it from a bit more of a scientific perspective, flowers, which we also call blooms or blossoms, are the reproductive structure of angiosperms. And angiosperms are a type of plant that is basically, they're defined by their ability to reproduce using flowers. So that's what angiosperms, that's what distinguishes them from all the other plants out there in the wild. Now, all flowering plants are something known as heterosporous, which means that they produce two different types of spores, and these are what we might call male or female, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. So the ultimate purpose of flowers is to allow plants to produce more plants, basically, by allowing the gametes of the different sexes to mix together. Now, there are a few plants where they do things a bit differently, but by and large, this is the basic thing that we see in all angiosperms. And sometimes this reproductive act can involve gametes that come from different individuals, and that's what we call outcrossing. But it also can involve selfing, when you've got both types of spore coming from the same original individual. And this is basically producing a clone. Now, the earliest fossil of a flowering plant dates to approximately 125 million years ago, so this is a pretty venerable lineage of organisms, but actually they may have existed some 250 million years ago. And this is something I actually talked about not too long ago on the show, and I talked about how the origin of flowering plants may have been pushed back a bit further than we originally thought, and also the origin of oxygen levels in the atmosphere that would support this sort of life. So plants are quite old, but as we do more analyses, we might find that, flowering plants are quite old, but as we do more analyses, we might find out that they're even older than we originally realized. And what we do know is that the adaptation of a flower structure was something that arose after the development of the seed. Now, of course, the seed is the thing that the flowering structure ultimately gives rise to, and it's the thing that will then produce that next generation of plant. And the seed was a terrestrially evolved structure that was designed to keep genetic material from drying out. So when plants originated in the water, they would have been able to produce spores that could have gone through the water and been kept moist because they're there in that aquatic habitat. But once they kind of creeped onto the land, they needed to have something that could keep that spore protected, and that's why we see the seed eventually evolving. And there's no clear continuous fossil evidence showing the development of flowers after these seeds were kind of taking over as a mode of reproduction on land. So we don't know exactly when did that happen, how long did it take, how did that happen, but we do know that angiosperms likely evolved from one of several extinct gymnosperms, and there are lots of gymnosperms out there that we could choose from, but one of the really big suspects, I guess you could call it, is something called a seed fern. And a seed fern is going to be something that's kind of in between almost the aquatic plants and the terrestrial plants, because they do like quite moist areas, and they do have characteristics of kind of both of these different types of organisms. Now, most researchers agree that flowers likely evolved to get animals involved in the reproduction process. So this is the primary goal of these things, because plants obviously could reproduce quite well on their own. They didn't need flowers to do it, but once they got onto the land and there were all these organisms there that could help them out with the reproductive process, maybe make things more efficient, more targeted, get things to the right habitat better, then it was advantageous to have these flower structures that could help with that whole process. And some people even think that they may know the type of habitats in which flowers originally evolved, and that potentially is an island-like habitat or some other isolated place where you would have had plant-animal relationships that could have developed very closely, been very specialized, and not been disrupted by lots of other species, lots of other things out there in the environment that kind of might change it up and make it different and kind of disrupt that process of, for lack of a better word, bonding between the two organisms, that really close evolutionary relationship that helped facilitate the specialization of a particular plant visitor and a particular type of flower. So all this evolutionary stuff kind of makes you think about the structure of a flower and how a flower works, because a lot of this stuff, and I will get back to this a bit later, it's really driven by the fact that you are using these flowers to attract or to interact with some sort of a pollinator or something that is going to help you get your genetic material out there in the world. And so all of these little things that we see in flowers, the size of them, the shape of them, the structure of them, all of that really comes down to how best can you create something that gets the genes out there. So there are all sorts of flowers, but a standard flower has 4 different basic types of structures, and all of these are attached to a stalk that tethers the flower to the rest of the plant. And if you think about the flowers that you know of, this sounds pretty obvious. You're actually familiar with this even if you couldn't name these structures, and even if you might not be able to dissect a flower with a botanist. You certainly can picture a daisy or a rose or anything that you've looked at for more than a few seconds, and you definitely have seen these structures because they are very much on display. And we see these often in our gardens, by the side of the road. These characteristics, again and again, we see them in all flowering plants. So each type of structure is arranged in a whorl, and this is a pattern of growth that radiates from a single point that surrounds or wraps around a stem. So the first of these is the calyx, and this is a whorl of sepals, which are they tend to be green, and they tend to be kind of leafy structures that protect the bud as it's developing. And these can usually be found just under the petals. The next type of structure is the corolla, and this is a whorl of petals, and of course petals are actually modified leaves, and we tend to think of them as being quite distinct from leaves because they often have a very different texture, they have a very different look and shape, but they are in fact descended from leaves, genetically speaking, and they surround the reproductive parts of the flowers, and often are the things that draw attention to the flower in terms of kind of attracting animals, insects and bats and that sort of thing. The next structure is the androecium, and this is basically Greek for man's house, and this is a whorl of stamens, and stamens are the parts of the plant that produce the pollen. Now the stamens themselves are made up of filaments, which they're like little stalk structures, and also anthers, which are the little bits that contain the things called microsporangia, and that's the place where you've got meiosis occurring to produce the genetically distinct haploid spores from the parent material in order to reproduce. So these are basically what you might think of as the testicles producing the sperm from the male portion of the plant. That's kind of a rough analogy for you there. Now the next bit is the gynoecium, and this is known as woman's house, and this is a whorl of all the female parts of the flower, and that includes the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And these 3 things together are often referred to also as the pistil. And all of this terminology is exactly why all my students, back when I used to help demonstrate for botany courses, they used to throw their hands up in the air and absolutely hate this field because it has so many phrases. But all these things do kind of have counterparts in human anatomy, so they kind of begin to make sense if you can think about how they relate to the same structures that we have. So, well, of course, I say that, but then I'm about to describe each of these things, which are a little bit different, but you can kind of see how there is a bit of an analogy. So the stigma is the plant's receptive tip, and this is the bit that collects pollen during pollination and also hosts the germinating pollen grain. So I guess you could kind of think of that as the uterus. The style is the collective term for the carpels, which are probably structures that derive from leaves, so kind of like petals, and they form a closed structure containing the ovules. So these are the structures that contain the female reproductive cells. So I guess in a way these are like ovaries. However, the plant also does have a part called the ovary, and this is the particular part of the pistil that holds the ovules and is located near the base of the petals and the sepals. And this is what produces what we might refer to as the plant's eggs. So as in humans, the male reproductive units are microsporangia, so they are much smaller than the female gametes, and they give rise to microspores via meiosis. Now, the female gametes are megasporangia, and these give rise to megaspores via meiosis. And I'll come back to these ideas a bit later when I talk about the actual fertilization process. And basically what you have to know is that the female one is much bigger, the male one is much smaller. This tends to make sense because the male ones are broadcast out either through the air or via an animal and are delivered to the female, so you might think, of course, they want to be a bit smaller and a bit more mobile. And both types of these spores develop into gametophytes inside the sporangia. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was the Lumineers with Flowers in Your Hair. And just before the break, I was talking about the reproductive units of flowers, and now I want to think a little bit about flower arrangement, and then I'll kind of bring both of these things together and think about the fertilization process and the actual act of reproduction in plants. So some plants produce a single flower per axis, whereas others have multiple flowers per axis. And when there are multiple flowers, the cluster is collectively known as an inflorescence. And this is a term that you might have heard at some point or another, maybe when you were out buying flowers to give to someone or to put in your garden. Now sometimes the flowers are arranged together in such a way that they appear to be one flower when in fact they're many. And this is the kind of thing that's actually quite interesting because often you can go your whole life and not realize that you're looking at multiple flowers instead of just a single one, or even vice versa. So for example, the calla lily looks like a single flower because it's got that yellow stem in the middle and then the big white petal on the outside. But actually it's an inflorescence, and the flowers are really, really tiny. They're lots and lots of them make up that little yellow bit right in the middle, and so it's basically a big tower of flowers. And then the white bit on the outside is a large bract, and a bract is a modified leaf that looks like a petal. Another example is daisies and sunflowers and other composite flowers, and these are also not single flowers, but in fact are inflorescences that are composed of what we call multiple florets. And these are more accurately described as petal heads, so that gigantic kind of dish-shaped thing that you see on top of a sunflower stalk, that is the petal head and not actually a flower. So there are two different types of small flowers in that particular plant. You've got ray flowers and disc flowers, and the discs are tiny symmetrical looking flowers that are right in the middle, and the rays are on the outside, and they have basically this one little thing that comes up on one side that kind of looks like a petal, but actually it's called a ligule, and those little things are what we would refer to those yellow bits that are on the outside, kind of the rays of the sunflower. So next time you look at a sunflower, take a closer look and you'll notice that actually there are lots and lots of little bits that make up that one big inflorescence. Now, thinking a little bit also about the arrangement of the reproductive organs is quite important when you're thinking about how a flower is laid out. So in most species, individual flowers have both carpels and stamens, so they have both females and male bits. And these are known as perfect or bisexual flowers, and the species then are known as hermaphroditic. But in some species, the flowers have only one or the other structure, and those flowers are known as imperfect or unisexual. So if staminate, which are male flowers, and carpellate, which are female flowers, can be found on the same plant, it's known as monoecious. And examples of this include plants in the birch family, so things like alders that have long catkins. All of those are male. Now, if staminate and carpellate flowers are only found on different plants of the same species, then you've got what's known as a dioecious plant. And examples of this include most hollies. And in fact, it's not too hard for you to learn how to tell the males and females apart. So you can go out into the woods and find male hollies and female hollies really easily because the flowers on them are quite distinct. And I actually had a botany professor that was able to do this very easily, and he could stand a dozen paces and kind of just glance and tell whether he was looking at a female or a male holly. And he would do this right at the beginning of the class before we learned anything about botany, because all of us just kind of assumed, well, I don't know that we assumed anything. We didn't know enough to make any assumptions, and he could stand there and tell us all about this and show us his amazing ability and then teach us how we could do that as well. And it's actually quite a cool trick. And if you're an outdoorsy person, you can impress people with that if you want to take the time to look closely. Now, one of the other things that's kind of a dead giveaway besides just looking at flowers is that only the female plants are able to create fruits and berries. So that means that this can actually be quite an important consideration for gardeners and landscapers. So if you've ever been around ginkgo trees when they're fruiting, you know that they absolutely reek. And if you are landscaping, then clearly you would want to plant male ginkgos and not female ginkgos, because then you can have that pretty leafy tree that looks quite nice in the landscape, but then not any of those berries that absolutely stink. And you track them home at night and it makes your whole house smell. So it's really nice to know those sorts of little things so that you can improve your gardening skills. Now, it's actually quite rare to find monoecious plants. So only about 6% of angiosperms are, it's rare to find dioecious plants. Only about 6% of angiosperms are dioecious, and only about 7% of all genera contain one or more dioecious plants. So these species are more likely to be either monoecious or hermaphroditic. What's really interesting, though, is that actually some species are able to change their gender over time. This has been observed, for example, in Amberella, which is a genus of shrubs and small trees that are endemic to New Caledonia. And the Amberella are dioecious species that produce flowers with either functional stamens or functional carpels, but not both of them at the same time. And studies have found that many of these individuals may start off male, but then turn into a female by the time they do their second flowering. And presumably the reverse is also possible, but no one has actually seen this yet for sure. And this seems to be a likely adaptation to prevent an inability to flower at a time when these things need to reproduce. So it would be, quite unfortunate if all of a sudden you found yourself growing somewhere and there weren't a partner nearby because you were all the same sex. And so to be able to switch back and forth, especially if you're able to sense something in the environment and react accordingly and switch at the right time, can obviously be quite useful and make sure that you're able to keep your species going. So plants, you might think that they are kind of boring things that just sit out there in the garden and don't do much, but actually there's quite a lot going on. They can have all sorts of characteristics that we don't necessarily see in humans and abilities that we don't see in humans. So plant reproduction can actually be quite exciting, and that is one of the reasons why we see so many interesting types of flowers, because flowers are so intimately involved in the whole reproduction process. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Jerry Douglas with You Are My Flower. And on today's show, I am talking about flowers, and the next thing I want to address is the importance of flower morphology to plant reproduction. Now, towards the beginning of the show, I said that one of the reasons that flowers are thought to have evolved is that they are a feature that can involve animals and basically other factors in the environment in the plant's reproductive process. So flower morphology is obviously going to be quite important because it is going to influence which of those external environmental factors you are going to be involving in the process, and in exactly what way they're going to be active and presumably helping the flowers as they reproduce. And this is one of the reasons why we see such tremendous variation in pretty much all characteristics of the flower. So things like shape, size, color, scent, when the blossom happens in terms of what time of year, but also what time of day, how long the blossoms last, where they are located on a plant, all sorts of things like this that do vary quite a lot from one species to another, and sometimes even within the same species. And all of this is driven by the selective pressure to transfer pollen successfully between two plants of the same species that are trying to reproduce at that given time. Now some plants self-pollinate, and these guys can propagate using non-opening self-pollinating flowers. So this is known as cleistogamy, or closed marriage, or automatic self-pollination. And this sort of flower is not going to be needing much help from the outside with reproduction. And examples of this include things like some violas and some salvia species. But a lot of researchers think that even though these plants are capable of reproducing in this way, there are likely also times where they also reproduce via chasmogamy, which is known open marriage, or reproducing with another individual. And in cases like that, or in the case of all the other plants that do this on a routine basis, most of these individuals are relying on some sort of vector to help them move pollen between plants. Abiotic vectors include things like wind and water, and a plant that is using wind to move its pollen is known as engaging in anemophily. One that uses water engages in hydrophily. Then you've got your biotic vectors, so things like insects, birds, bats. Those are the most common, but also other animals can help as well. And plants that engage in those things are using entomophily, ornithophily, and chiropterophily. Those are all quite hard to say. Those are good Scrabble words. So all of those are different forms of getting some other organism or entity to help you spread your seeds. Now some plants do also rely purely on gravity, so basically you just got your pollen up there in the top somewhere, and then at some point you just kind of release it and let it drop, and wherever it goes, often on a little individual underneath you or even on your own lower branches, that is how the reproduction happens. But most organisms try to broadcast a bit more widely, a bit more distantly, and so that's why these other organisms and environmental factors can be quite useful. Now some plants can utilize multiple vectors at the same time, so some plants might be using insects and water and birds, for example, but this tends to be more rare because specialization can help ensure that pollen is getting to the correct species, things are happening in the right time frame, in the right way, and reproduction is going to be most successful. And if there isn't this close relationship between the plant and the pollinator, then you risk accidentally giving your pollen to something or to someone that's going to drop it off at the wrong destination and end up with a failed reproductive attempt. So plant-pollinator relationships have driven the evolution of lots of different floral structures that facilitate or improve floral transfer. Pollination can only occur during a period that's known as anthesis, and that is when flowers are both open and receptive. And one thing that can help with all of this, to attract the interest of these potential pollinators, is nectaries. And nectaries, as you might guess, are the glands that provide nectar. And nectar, of course, acts as an incentive for visits to the flower. Now, nectar is quite a costly thing to manufacture because sugar is a source of energy. You can store away energy for a future time when you might need it. And so it's quite a thing for a plant to give that up and give it instead to an insect or a bird or a bat, because it doesn't know that it's not going to need that in the future, but it does have to kind of weigh that against the really absolute urge to reproduce before it dies. And so the amount that it gives, or whether it gives it at all, that is going to be kind of a trade-off in how it's perceiving the current conditions, and whether it's going to be better to hurry up and reproduce and do that with the help of a pollinator, or kind of maybe hold on for a while, use up its own resources for itself, and then later on, potentially, hopefully, have a reproduction event. Now, floral nectaries are usually found just at the base of the perianth, which is the structure that's made up of the calyx and the corolla together. And this means that pollinators, in order to access the nectaries, are having to brush up against the anthers and the pistil when they're accessing the nectar. And this means that they're picking up the pollen from one plant, and then when they go to the next, they're going to brush that pollen all over the other structures as they're rooting around for the nectaries there. So it's a really efficient way to make sure that the insects or birds are consistently in the same place, in the right place of each different flower that they visit, in order to pick up and drop off the things that need to be transferred. There are also structures known as nectar or floral guides, and these are patterns that show pollinators where to look for the rewards. Now obviously this kind of makes sense because even though I've just said to you where the nectary is, if you're a bee that's going out for the very first time, you might not know what a nectary is, you might not know where to find it, and so it's quite helpful to have some sort of a cue that helps you find that right place on the flower and hurry up and go to where you're supposed to go. So there are these patterns that help pollinators see where it is that they should be focusing their efforts, and they can be in colors, and they may be in interesting kind of designs, but whatever the case is, they are drawing the attention. And actually there are also guides not just to where the nectaries are, but they also may point the way towards pollen, towards oil, towards resin, towards scents and waxes, all the different things that flowers produce in order to make themselves more attractive to pollinators and make them more likely to be visited. And the patterns are often visible to humans, but sometimes that's not the case because a lot of pollinators, so things like honeybees for example, can see in the ultraviolet range. And so a lot of these things you don't actually see them until you've got them under UV light. And then you can see dark patterns or little shapes, for example kind of runway shapes that show where it is that the pollinators need to go and focus their efforts. Another thing we often see also in flowers is mimicry. So you've got many flowers that look or smell like interesting things, in particular female bees, and that will attract, in this case, males that want to come and try to copulate with the females. So there they are, rubbing themselves up against the flowers, in the process of which they pick up pollen. They finally learn that it's not a female. They fly off to the next flower, try to copulate with that as well, and then drop off the pollen there. Now a lot of these bees will eventually kind of learn this, and so this is not always the most effective way, but some bees are really stupid and they just keep going and keep going and keep going because that visual stimulus is so strong that they just always have the urge to give it a shot. And you probably have seen this at some point if you've ever watched a David Attenborough show. Orchids do this quite a lot, and there is some really good footage of David Attenborough watching this actually quite close by as these silly bees come, and I think wasps as well, and just try and completely fail to have their own reproductive effort, but really help the plants in their bid to successfully produce new young. Scent, size, and color are other things that can be used to make flowers more attractive. And what's really interesting about these three things is that although you sometimes find combinations of these things in quite showy ways, often you will have alternations. So for example, if you've got very large or brightly colored flowers that can easily be found by sight, then there's not really a need for them to have a strong smell. And smell is going to be something that, again, is kind of costly to manufacture because it involves certain resources from the plant. So if you've already got your bases covered with your color and your shape and your size, then there's no need to also produce a smell. And flowers that are pollinated in situations where they can't easily be seen, on the other hand, will often need a really strong smell so that they can be detected at a great distance. And this means that they aren't putting their resources into having a gigantic flower or a flower of a particular color, but instead they're creating that scent and distributing the scent through the air. So just to give you a couple of examples, flowers that are pollinated by bats and moths tend to have a very strong scent because there they are blooming in the nighttime. Obviously they can't be seen very well. And they often tend to be white, so they're unpigmented. The flower is not wasting energy getting pigments from the environment and putting that into its petals. Also, you will find sometimes that very small flowers are often some of the nicest smelling, or at least I should say the strongest smelling, because they might often otherwise be overlooked. So if they don't have that really obvious characteristic of the scent, it would be quite easy for a pollinator to pass them on by. And it's important to note here, the reason I corrected myself when I said nice smelling, is that really nice is from the perspective of the pollinator rather than from humans. So some insects are attracted to things that we would find absolutely disgusting. For example, rotting flesh. So some flowers smell like dead animals. And these are often known as carrion flowers, respectively. So things like Rafflesia and the North American pawpaw, they smell absolutely atrocious, but to a pollinator that is an irresistible scent. And the last thing I want to mention is that the shape of a flower can often be quite important because the arrangement of the stamens is generally such that it's optimized to ensure the transfer of pollen grains. So this is often paired with an attractant of some sort that is alluring or rewarding enough to ensure that the pollinator is not just going to come once and rub up against all of those stamens, but it's going to go back a second time and then deliver the pollen to another flower. And again, this is ensuring that not only are you delivering the pollen, but you're getting it to the real place that it needs to go. You're not just indiscriminately taking it from an iris to a rose, for example. You're going from an iris to an iris to an iris. And that is really key in making sure that the reproductive events aren't completely down to chance, but you can control them a little bit as a plant and make sure that your genes are getting to where they need to go. Welcome back to the wild side. That was Kasey Chambers with This Flower. Now the next thing I want to talk about in my kind of brief summary of flowers and plant reproduction is the fact that not all flowers have all the sorts of characteristics that I was just talking about before the break. So things like really interesting shapes that optimize the transfer of pollen, things like really strong scents, really bright colors, mimicry of pollinators, things like nectar and floral guides, and also things like nectar dissemination facilities known as nectaries. So not all plants have to have these sorts of things, and that's because not all plants need to worry about a pollinator. So plants that rely on the wind, for example, they don't have to have really showy flowers, and that includes things like birches, for example, grasses, ragweeds, maples. All these things have much more simple flowers than the ones we're used to seeing in a grocery store or in a greenhouse when we go to buy a present for someone or populate our garden. So often these sorts of species will have long filaments that have exposed stamens, which again are the male flowers, and long feathery stigmas, so the female flowers. And that is because they can just release the pollen grains that catch the wind quite easily and are then caught easily on the other end by the receiver. So these guys can just wait on the weather basically to help them out. And in these species, the pollen grains tend to be very small and light and unnutritious. And that means that they are quite easily distributed through the air, and they're not going to be intercepted by something that's interested in eating them and preventing them from getting where they need to go. And I remember when I used to live in Virginia, it was the most amazing thing that would happen every spring when the pine trees would pollinate the air. And it was just incredible because the pollen was very, very, very fine, and it was bright yellow, kind of a yellowy green. And so you could always tell exactly when the pollination was happening because you would just have blankets of this covering every available surface. And it was incredibly light dust, and you could just almost see it in the air because there was such a mass of it everywhere. And it was really effective because it distributed all over the place. So you would find it even in places where there weren't pine trees, because the pollen was so light that it would just hang on the barest breeze and then be taken hundreds of meters away, probably even distances of miles before it would settle again. So this is a really effective way of transmitting your genetic material. And of course this contrasts quite a lot with the pollen that's associated with animal pollinated flowers. And often here we have things that are large-grained and sticky and protein-rich. So if you picture a bee, if you've ever seen a bee with the little kind of pollen sacs on its legs, then you know that it can be very easily visible, quite large, and quite interesting to species because some of them do eat the pollen. And that is because this stuff is designed to be a reward. So even though the pollinators are eating some of it, they inevitably will leave some behind, and that is what gets to the final destination and is able to reproduce with the next flower down the line. And this actually is a nice segue into flower-pollinator relationships. Now many flowers, as I mentioned earlier, have exclusive relationships with their pollinators, and that is often a case of coevolution, where these guys for hundreds, thousands, millions of years have co-evolved so that every little change in one is met with a change in another, and they become better and better and better suited to help each other out. And this means that decreases in the population of one can have significant impacts on the other. And that is one of the things we're seeing right now in honeybee populations that are hurt by pesticides and diseases and all the other problems that seem to be kind of simultaneously attacking these insects. And because these guys are decreasing, this means that there are all these species out there that they are not pollinating, and those species are also declining. And this is true not just of native things that are growing in the wild, but also our own crops, so that we're having to cart honeybees around from one farm to the next to get the job of pollination done. So this is a really fundamental and important relationship that we find out there in the wild, and when this breaks down, it can have huge catastrophic implications for other species that rely on the fruits and on the new young plants that are created by the reproductive process of plants. Now, that actually, again, I keep segueing accidentally into the next important topic, which is quite handy. So that brings me to the actual act of fertilization and fruiting, which is another thing that we kind of forget about, when we eat fruit, that this is actually a reproductive product that we're munching on. So in some plants, you've got self-fertilization, and usually this is not considered a good thing because it can lead to basically inbreeding. You're not getting rid of the genes that you don't want, but you also can then be assured that you're keeping the genes that you do want. So there are kind of trade-offs here. And some organisms do always self-fertilize, so things like hawthorns and rowans, brambles, hawkweeds, dandelions, things like that. And this occurs via a process that's known as apomixis, when this produces offspring that are genetically identical to the parent plant, so clones. And these guys, as I said, they lose out on gene swapping via sexual reproduction, so that's one of the big reasons probably why we do have sex. But it ensures that if you've got a good trait, you definitely are passing it on to your young, and you're not potentially losing them or getting some weird version of them in the next generation. Now, most plants are thought to undergo something called facultative apomixis, and this means that they can actually engage in sexual reproduction, but they don't have to do it all the time. And researchers haven't really been able to study this enough to get a really good handle on what is happening out there, but I think kind of the current opinion is that there's a whole lot of obligate apomixis out there, there's a whole lot of facultative apomixis out there, and then some obligate apomixis, which means this is the only thing you are doing. You can only self-fertilize. But it seems that that's probably quite rare, and that what's happening most of the time is that you have lots of plants that choose to self-fertilize quite a lot of the time, but every now and then, just to mix it up and keep the gene flow going, they do also have sex with other plants. And so what researchers are hoping to do is just do a lot of observations and eventually catch these plants doing this other mode of reproduction that they're being suspected of. But for most things, you do have the sexual reproduction, so you're collecting the pollen of another organism. And once you've got that pollination event, a tube grows from the pollen grain through the stigma into the ovary and then into the ovule. And 2 sperm are delivered to the megagametophyte, and that, of course, is going to be the female's egg. And that is a process known as double fertilization. And one of these sperms unites with the egg and forms the zygote that's going to be the baby plant eventually. And the second one enters the endosperm mother cell. And this creates the endosperm, as you might guess, which are the nutritive tissues that the embryo can use as it develops. So if you think about an apple, if you think about an avocado, actually an avocado is a really good example, because if you get an avocado when it's good, then you know that it's got kind of a small seed in the middle, and that the outside, the texture of the fruit is quite nice. But if you let it go a bit too long and open it up, then the seed is much, much bigger, there's much less fruit around it, and also there's quite a different texture, and it's quite unpleasant. And that's because that seed has been using all of that fruit around it as energy, it's been burning through it, and so there's less fruit for you to eat, and it's quite a different texture because it has been processed in some way. So that is what the endosperm is. That is what we are eating. So it's kind of like eating a chicken egg in a way, the white portion of the chicken egg, that energy that's there for the developing embryo. So in some fruits, you've got the additional parts of the flower, so things like petals and sepals and stamens, involved in the development of the fruit, and they may fuse with the ovary and ripen along with it. And this is particularly common in fruits that are derived from what's known as an inferior ovary, or one that's positioned below the attachment of the floral parts. And this just has to do with kind of, the structure and how it all works out best to produce the seeds and the fruit that surround it. So when these are a significant part of the fruit, these additional parts, it's known as an accessory fruit, which means that it's pulled in all these accessory materials to make it. And we see this in things like strawberries and figs and mulberries. And those are all made from a portion of the plant known as the receptacle. We also see it in apples and pears, and those are made from a portion known as the hypanthium, or the calyx stamen, plus a partly fused portion of the corolla. And that is also, all these things are also known as false fruits, spurious fruits, pseudo-fruits, and pseudocarps, because it's not just the fruit bit itself, but also other portions of the plant that cumulatively make up the fruit. Now when this doesn't happen, all those additional parts just fall off because they're not needed any longer. The ovary ripens as the ovules develop into seeds, so that's basically what I was describing there with the avocado. And the ovary well, or the pericarp, also undergoes changes and either becomes fleshy, so that's what we have when we've got things like berries and drupes, or it becomes quite hard, and that's what a nut is. So a nut is a fruit, it's just because it's so different we don't tend to call it the same thing. We call it a whole new word. Now there are lots of different types of fruit, and these are not necessarily evolutionarily relevant categories, but they do reflect how the flower organs are arranged and how the fruits develop. And so that's how we tend to refer to them, even though it's maybe not the most scientific of ways to think about them. So simple fruits result from the ripening of simple or compound ovary in a flower that only has one pistil. And these things can be dry or fleshy, they can be dehiscent or indehiscent, and that means that they either open up to discharge the fruit or they don't open up to discharge the fruit. There are also things known as aggregate fruits, and these form from single flowers that have multiple carpels that are not joined together. So basically you've got each pistil containing one carpel. And each pistil itself forms a fruitlet, and then the fruitlets together are cumulatively known as an atereo. So four types that we are familiar with include atereos of the achenes, so these are simple dry fruits, so like the little seeds that we see in strawberries. Follicles, so dry fruits that usually have a single dehissing suture, so one little opening through which all the seeds come, so things like milkweeds. Druplets, which are aggregates of multiple drupes, so things like a blackberry. And berries, which are fleshy fruit in which the whole ovary wall ripens into an edible pericarp, so things like avocados and grapes. And what you'll notice there is that the things that we refer to as berries, so things like blackberries and raspberries, they aren't necessarily actually the scientific definition of berries. This is just kind of the colloquial phrase for these things. So all those are different types of this particular form of aggregate fruit. And I bet you always thought that a strawberry was a single fruit, but now you know that actually it's lots of little fruits that are all combined into one major thing that you eat. And then the final thing is the multiple fruit. And these are formed from an inflorescence in which you've got each flower producing a single fruit that all then mature together into one mass. And that's something like a pineapple or a fig or a breadfruit. And actually, if you think about what a pineapple looks like, this probably makes a lot of sense, because you know how it has on the outside, it's got those little kind of football-like patterns, or the little hexagon kind of shapes that all fit together, and they each have that little tuft, that little leafy tuft right in the middle. Well, each one of those represents the fruit that has formed from a flower, and then all of those things have fused into that one gigantic pineapple shape that we know. Now, as with the flowers, the forms of the fruits are designed to promote the dispersal of the seeds that they contain. So sometimes these things are very attractive in terms of being eaten, or they're very unattractive in terms of making things avoid consumption. Some of them might stick to animals, so things like cockleburs. They might explode, so this is known as explosive dehiscence, and we see that in things like touch-me-nots and then the squirting cucumber, which again is something you've probably seen footage of on a David Attenborough film at some point. Some of them are designed to be buried, so for example nuts that are hoarded by rodents, they rely on the fact that these rodents are going to bury them so that the nuts have time to mature in the way that they should, and then to use the resources in the soil around them to actually germinate and grow. Some of them are designed to be carried by the wind, so things like the maple helicopters that kind of fly down and land in funny ways. If you've ever watched them floating from the very top of the tree, you think this is the most ridiculous flight, but actually it's perfectly designed because it makes sure that as they're whirling away and getting caught up in the wind, they blow away from that parent tree and they get out from underneath the canopy where they might actually grow and not be competing with the parent plant. And then the final thing, well, not the final thing, but the last on my list anyway, is that also fruits are designed to float in the water. So things like coconuts are designed to be able to weather hundreds and thousands of miles of floating around in the sea in order to finally reach a destination, a shore of a new island, for example, and then take root there and grow into a new plant. And we see that also in mangroves. The mangrove fruit is perfectly designed to bob along in the waves and finally set down on a new shore and grow there. So all of these things, both the flowers and the fruits that they eventually form, are perfectly designed to either be attractive or not be attractive and to get where they need to go in order to produce a new plant. So that is actually why it's a perfect time to talk about these things on the show, because for Valentine's Day, when you're often getting someone some chocolate-covered strawberries or a nice bouquet of roses, you're often doing that because you're feeling a bit romantic, and actually it's very appropriate to do that sort of gift on that sort of day, because these things are all about romance, flower and plant romance. So you are carrying on that tradition. Maybe you didn't know that before, but now you do, and potentially you can impress your loved one with your knowledge of the natural world when you go to give them all of your gifts this Friday. So I hope you enjoyed that show. I'm going to end up with Moby, appropriately, with the song Flower, and I will talk to you next week.